Chapter 6 of Travels and Adventures of an Orchid Hunter by Albert Millican. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vegetation. At first the path lay along the 3 miles of railway which had been constructed and abandoned several years before. This had now become entirely filled up with creepers and tall grass. Leaving the last rail behind, we quickly plunged into the thick forest, where the road became a mere trail, which made it extremely difficult to proceed. First we were scrambling over some fallen trunks, then cutting our way through a thicket of prickly acacias, sometimes wading up to the knees in ditches caused by the heavy rains, at other times swinging ourselves, monkey-like, from one branch of a tree to another, in order to cross the turbulent, swift-running rivers without wetting our ammunition and provisions. But even with these difficulties, the path all the while lay through the midst of a vegetation of indescribable luxuriance and beauty, nature's original productions as yet unmarred by the woodman's axe or the ploughshare. Gigantic timber trees from 70 to 100 feet in height, festooned to the very summit with creeping alamandas, all aglow with their golden trumpet-like flowers, mixed and varied with the scarlet stars of the Tacsonia Van Valksimi, or the rich blue of the Ipomaea, and the undergrowth of palms of the elegant Phoenix and Cocos families. These were supplemented by a carpet of the most beautiful mosses and low-flowering shrubs, while on the banks of the streams the rich crimson flowers of the creeping Certodira fulgida contrasted beautifully with its richly pencilled leaves of velvet and gold, everything that could illustrate the glories of the vegetable kingdom, with the exception of orchids. And for these I scanned the trees eagerly, but always fruitlessly, on account of the altitude at which the best orchids are found being very much above the level of the Magdalena Valley. But nature had been scarcely less prodigal in her provision of animal life. Large and small lizards of the most exquisite markings, some which seemed to possess a coat of mail made of silver and turquoise, disturbed in their afternoon nap, hurried quickly out of sight in the long grass, while birds of every fantastic shape and colour flitted in and out of the feathery palms. Occasionally we came in contact with a colony of large brown monkeys, those missing links of Darwinian celebrity. At the sight of us they set up such a chatter as would almost lead one to suppose that they were discussing on the spot what possible motive could have induced us to venture so far from civilization. The woods were full of a kind of wild turkey, but we were not successful in shooting any. However, we bagged some birds about the size of a hen, which appeared to be a kind of grouse. The sun, already low in the heavens, warned us that it was time to prepare our camp, and in this my 2 guides proved how well they were accustomed to this kind of life. The forest to these primitive architects supplies everything. While the elder one was cutting some stout poles, the younger one disappeared and as quickly reappeared with an armful of fine creepers, with which the poles were lashed together, first placing my mackintosh on the top, and then a thick covering of large palm leaves, so that in less than an hour they had finished the construction of a commodious shed. Not having been occupied in building operations, I had meanwhile made a fire and prepared the grouse for cooking. These, well boiled with some of the cassava roots, made us an excellent supper, being doubly acceptable, for the long march since the midday meal had given us almost wolfish appetites. After supper we prepared each one a small calabash of steaming coffee, boiled in the lard tin and sweetened with raw sugar. After this each one was content to light his roll of tobacco and so pass the night by the campfire. Before daylight the next morning we were astir, and raking together the smouldering embers of last night's fire, prepared our black coffee and roasted some bananas. This temperate repast quickly and unceremoniously dispatched, each one shouldered his load, and again we plunged into the dense forest. We had not gone far before a stream of considerable dimensions stopped our way, for the time offering great obstructions, not so much for ourselves, who could easily cross by swimming, but how to pass our packs with any sort of security offered no small difficulty. Finally, finding a large tree fallen half way across the stream, by dint of one helping another we were able to pass, and so continued our journey. At noon, as on the previous day, we stopped to cook our midday meal and to rest a short time, for although, on account of the thick forest, the sun did not strike upon us much, still the heat in the middle of the day was extremely oppressive. Besides, the fatigue occasioned by cutting our way through the thick clumps of prickly acacias made us glad to seek a little repose. Continuing our way after some refreshment, the track, as on the previous day, lay through the same extravagance of vegetable and animal life. 1,000 delicate creepers hung in graceful festoons, and woven into a tapestry compared with which a Gobelin picture would make a poor contrast. After a tiresome march, at the end of the second day we arrived at the only hut which is to be found in all the journey through this part of the forest, and, considering that the nearest neighbours are on every side at least 30 miles distant, the inhabitants of this forest prison, as might be supposed, had partaken considerably of the nature of their surroundings. A hut of the most primitive construction, stocked with a few calabashes, sloth and tiger cat skins, and blocks of wood. The proprietor of the hut, an old hunter, showed himself extremely friendly, and immediately offered us part of the provision nearest to hand, being some cassava roots, bananas, and bread made of Indian corn ground between 2 stones. Here we passed the night, the whole of the next day, and the following night, as guests of the kindly native, being obliged to make this delay on account of a terrific thunderstorm and heavy rain, which continued to fall all day. As the forest dried up somewhat in the night, early next morning we prepared ourselves again for the journey. But as the provisions which we had brought with us were all exhausted, and we could buy nothing more here, we left somewhat depending on the chance of meeting some stray wild pig or anything else which might come within range of our guns. From the hut which we left in the morning to the next hut in the forest was a distance of 24 miles, and there it was not certain that we should meet with any inhabitants. We continued along the track with much the same surroundings as formerly, up to midday, and as we had seen nothing to shoot but some monkeys, we were reduced to the necessity of making our lunch off some pineapples and other fruits, which are plentiful enough. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while still following the track, we left the thick forest and suddenly broke into what appeared to be a large dried up lake, the ground being perfectly flat, and a kind of fine powdery sand covering the entire surface. The only vegetation consisted of patches of miserable scrub here and there. Having no exact information of the breadth of the plain, it appeared to me that we had walked about 5 miles when we again struck into the forest. These 5 miles we had passed with the greatest difficulty. An almost vertical sun heated the sand to a great degree and rendered the atmosphere stifling. Besides, at each step the foot sank into the powdery mass up to the ankle. Nothing living was to be seen, but at short intervals we passed the tracks of wild cattle, as well as many footprints of the jaguar and tiger cat, which are plentiful enough in all this part. The footprints of cattle surprised me, as large wild animals, such as the buffalo or bison, are entirely unknown in these forests. However, my companions informed me the race had originally escaped from some settlement on the edge of the forest. After some rest we again struck on the path, being anxious to reach the hut before night. Darkness came on suddenly about 6:30 o'clock, as is usual in this latitude, and, unfortunately for us, with night the thunder began to roll through the sky, while the black clouds, illuminated with bright streaks of lightning, warned us that a storm was approaching. We still kept on our way, in hopes of reaching the hut, but in vain. Quickly drops began to fall, and then the fearful torrent which followed would make one believe that a cataract had broken loose over our heads. The scanty shreds of clothing which each one wore were soon soaked. My top boots as quickly filled, and the water ran over the tops, while the track became a stream. Everything which we carried became running with water. The light pith with which the natives so easily produce fire, together with the matches I had, were equally rendered useless. We were exhausted with the fatigue of the day's march, and were without fire or provisions, and the violence of the storm rendered it almost impossible to construct even a temporary shelter. Besides, without this, to stop short of the hut was to hazard our lives. The two natives behaved admirably, going first, scrambling through the tangled brushwood, the track being only discernible at intervals, when the brilliant lightning lit up the gloomy surroundings. About 2 hours after the storm broke upon us, impelled by sheer desperation, we arrived at the hut. A tumble down shed, as may be supposed, with the rain coming through in every part of the roof. But to our joy there was a fire in the place, and on examining further we discovered 3 natives huddled up in the driest part of the shed. These were travellers like ourselves, on their way from Bucaramanga to the river Magdalena. They had arrived before the storm, having had time to collect wood and cook their supper. Of the little provisions which they possessed, they sold us some cassava roots and a little raw sugar. Quickly disencumbering ourselves of our dripping remnants of clothing, we boiled some of the raw sugar in water. This makes an excellent and refreshing drink when it is drunk warm. Being somewhat refreshed with this, we next prepared the cassava roots, and supped well on these, and my companions heaping a large pile of wood on the fire, we waited for daylight, making ourselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances, not unmindful to Providence that we were better there than in the open forest without shelter. Morning revealed to us the woods in all their grandeur again, with scarce a trace of the hurricane which had swept over us the previous evening. Our first consideration was to dry everything we possessed by spreading it in the sun. Meanwhile our companions, who were going in the opposite direction, had breakfasted and taken to the track. The preparation of our baggage delayed us until nearly noon, but the guide said that we should find another hut at about 12 miles distance. Towards evening we came in sight of the Andes, having nearly crossed 1/2 of the magnificent valley of the Magdalena. Before sunset we had reached the hut, which was situated about 1/2 mile up the side of the mountain on a slight level, a situation which commands one of the grandest sights it is possible to see. On the right the magnificent forest plain stretches out towards the sea for 200 miles, and on the other hand as much. The river Magdalena is navigable for large steamboats about 900 miles, and from this point of the Andes on a clear day there is at least 500 miles of the valley visible, while directly in front may be seen the mighty range of mountains of Antioquia and Bolivar at a distance of 100 miles or more. The river may be seen from this point like a gilded serpent gliding away down towards the sea, its silvery coils contrasted beautifully with the sombre green of the forest. This evening we were more fortunate than the night before. Here we met with a party of Colombians engaged in taking out gutta percha, and they offered us every hospitality which their scanty resources afforded. We started away next morning more refreshed and in better spirits than on the previous day. This hut is called Las Mercedes, and is situated about halfway up the mountain, from which the town of Bucaramanga lies some 25 miles on the other side. Before midday we reached the top of the mountain. From this elevation the view is even more beautiful than before, and the clear, bracing air gives us an idea that the range of hills is at least 4,000 feet high. From here as well we began to discern the cultivated land and small villages on the outside of the forest. After about 4 hours more of a most toilsome march down the side of the mountain, where the track is scarcely discernible on account of the thicket of creepers, we emerged into cleared ground and a fairly beaten track. Passing several straggling huts, we finally reached a large house covered with red tiles, an excellent specimen of the better class of country house in the interior of this part of Colombia, the owner being a coffee planter of considerable importance. We arrived here in the evening, and near to the house we were met by a crowd of young men and women, each one bearing a large basket filled with coffee berries, each workman being paid according to the weight of fruit picked during the day. The berries are afterwards spread out on cemented floors in the sun, where the outside rind of the fruit is taken off, and the coffee beans cleaned by first beating them in a mortar and then subjecting them to a kind of winnowing process. The excellent Colombian proprietor of the estate, which is called El Naranjo, or the orange tree, treated us with every kindness, which was doubly welcome after the rough life we had just experienced. I passed the night here, and early next morning engaged mules to proceed on my journey to the town of Bucaramanga. The road from this point to the town is supposed to be good, which in fact it is, compared with some of the roads. But for anyone who has not an idea of what is called a road in the Republic of Colombia, I may describe it as a mere track, worn into existence by the continual passing of mules, with packs and riders, often taking a roundabout way where a near one is at hand, or climbing over a stony precipice when, with the least forethought, it might have been avoided. Besides, in the rainy season the clayey soil becomes impregnated with water and works into a kind of substance in which the mules sink up to the saddle girth, which makes it impossible for any other beasts but such as are accustomed to these roads to extricate themselves. On leaving El Naranjo, the road lay through numerous plantations of coffee, cocoa, and sugar cane, broken at intervals by large patches of scrub. The farmhouses are supplied with numerous buildings for drying tobacco, crushing sugar cane, and preparing what is called panela. This is the juice of the cane, boiled, poured into moulds, and left to cool. These moulds are square, and the pieces of sugar are invariably small cakes about the size of a box of sardines. As the juice has undergone no process of refinement, the sugar produced in this way is generally very dirty, and of a colour as dark as roasted coffee beans. This is produced in very large quantities, and is entirely consumed in the country, either for cooking or in making the native beer, or guarapo. After about 9 miles riding we came to a small village called Canta Abra. This soon showed us how much the difference of elevation had to do with the social condition of the people compared with the natives of the valley of the Magdalena. Instead of the strong Indian or Negro type, so marked in the natives of the lowland, the Colombians here are fair-skinned, good-looking, and well-dressed. Although the village is one of the smallest in the vicinity of Bucaramanga, it boasts of a good, large Roman Catholic church and several well-built houses, but of course all of mud, or what is called adobe. Here we breakfasted in true Colombian style, a piece of salt beef and cakes made of Indian corn. Besides, we had the inevitable cassava root and coffee. The coffee made here on a coffee estate, as may be supposed, is an exquisite beverage, possessing all the rich aroma which the berry loses by a long sea voyage. After breakfast we started away at a rattling pace, which did not slacken until we had gained the summit of a hill from which were easily discernible the strange half Moorish, half Spanish towers of Bucaramanga. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Arnold Banner, Thurmond, North Carolina.